How's it going, everyone? Session here. Welcome to the Futures Rewritten Theoretical Ultimate. This is going to serve as the Phase 4 cover of the mechanics section that we've been crafting over the course of this presentation. And I wanted to, again, give like a quick heads up that this is not meant to be used as a guide. This is a fun little project I designed to really showcase the storytelling of the Ultimate that I thought was a little bit like lackluster in comparison to the final version, as well as the mechanical execution, hoping that it was going to be that much more difficult in comparison. And so this is exactly what that is going to be from my own personal perspective. So with the mechs in mind, I definitely would say, like out loud, clear first and foremost, don't use this as a reference for how to actually perform the phase 4 section of the ultimate. This is a much more difficult and a lot more complicated version, I think, in comparison. And again, it's just meant to be fun and actually like explain how I would have designed the ultimate had I had the ability to actually make those changes. Or even like apply some of the rules that we have here. So without further ado, we have the theory mechanics of the oracles for phase 4. Now, if we've been keeping up with how they've been theoretically crafted over the course of phases 1 through 3, just to give like a quick recap, since we've kind of been doing this for a while already, phase 2 would still follow the same functional flow, where having Gaia use her hammer to smash the ice field and release Shiva, aka Metron, as the usurper of Frost, would have allowed the fragments of fate to enter Shiva and kind of complete one part of the puzzle. And then in the same format with phase 3 with Gaia, having a healer use LB3 would have temporarily given Gaia some consciousness and then allowed her to have the realization of like, oh my gosh, right? And then the puzzle would have been completed for phase 3 and would have dropped the fragment of relativity, which would have also entered Gaia. And as a result of trying to continue to pursue the challenge of creating the ultimate life form as a result of fulfilling the promise, as Metron has been setting forth since the beginning of time, realizing that we're going into phase 4 is Metron understanding that the link is being weakened across the board for her to be able to be absorbed and have using Shiva's body to create Pandora. So entering phase 4, Usurper Frost will start casting Materialization, and as we know in the normal version of the Ultimate, there's always one fragment that appears, and it is the Fragment of Fate, and it will be at the north platform, true north if you will, for entering this phase. However, my version actually incorporates 3 different crystal fragments, and they all appear on a different cardinal. There is going to be the fragments of Fate and Relativity, respectively belonging to Gaia and Reen, but then there will also be the fragments of Promise, and it'll be a red crystal, and the objective of the puzzle for this phase is that it must be destroyed by the end of the phase. And it'll always appear either on the west or east side of the arena to kind of allocate the mechanics that we have established for it as well. Now, I would like to emphasize a very particular point about how we destroy the memory of promise. Now, objectively, the goal of this phase is that we must destroy the red crystal and keep the other 2 remaining in order to enter phase 5 with something that I have in mind. Now, to kind of allocate this a little bit further and keep the danger factor, if you will, for phase 4 in comparison to the normal version, if a player stands under the blue fragment, that being Fate or Relativity, then they will receive a Vulnerability Up debuff, which will one-hit KO any player and must be avoided. And of course, additionally, it will destroy the Fate crystals as well, or Relativity crystal, and so we must avoid that at all costs. The objective is to keep those crystals alive as normal all the way through the entirety of the phase. It's the exact same thing how it is in the normal version of the Ultimate. However, if a player stands under a red fragment, then they will receive a vulnerability down debuff, which will actually let the players survive certain attacks. And part of it is actually used to destroy the fragment, because attacks that will normally hurt a lot will actually hurt a little bit less as a result of that buff. And you use the red crystal, and standing under it will result in that ability to actually survive certain hits. But on top of that, though, the Fragment of Promise will also let out a raid wide for each hit that it takes damage. So objectively, you want to hit the crystal with one attack that'll only do 1 hit, so that the raid wide will have a counterattack situation to it. And this is a little bit different from the normal version, because in the standard current version of Fru, the Fragment of Fate that only one has an appearance will like occasionally let out a raid wide, but it's like a little ignored because your goal is to just kind of deal with all the healing that it kind of compensates for anyways. So the way how the healing works in general kind of just works naturally. This one is actually a much more controlled execution of having to deal with counterattack raid wides, if you will, and having it center around the memory of Promise actually kind of holds that weight. So it's a great thing. Now, normally the boss will be brought to the middle, and Shiva will call upon her Velgar and turn into her dragon form, and then as a result of her transforming, it'll place Akrais, which are giant Akmoran puddles, if you will, that appear under each player, and this is normally baited in the middle. Then we do our splits and similarities to Rampant, and that way we can actually allow people to prepare themselves for the Darklit Dragon Song mechanic that will be casted. Now, objectively, placing the Darkrai or the Akrai underneath the boss is still paramount because it's a multi-hitting Akmoran attack that'll go off under each player. If it were to be baited under the fragment of Promise, for example, it'll multiplicatively let out a raid wide each time. And I believe the number of hits that does go off in the regular version is like 8. So to deal with 8 raid wides is kind of a lot, you know? So that way we don't have to deal with it in that case scenario, but it is an incorrect way of doing damage to the memory fragment. So objectively, you're not supposed to do that. So I just want to kind of give you like an example of how that would work out in that kind of moment. Now, the party will set up spots for Dark the Dragon Song, and it's adjusted to make a bow tie as formed, which is the same thing that we have in the normal version of the Ultimate as well. And then, of course, tethered players will have to stay in particular place, and untethered players will bait Path of Light, and they must be baited away from all of the fragments. There is a really easy way that it is currently baited, just, you know, with the single crystal being north, but since there are 3 crystals, none of them can actually hit that particular Path of Light. Adjusting for the party spots for Darklit, as you can see, it'll have assumed that the cones go off, and then the party will then spread for a Spirit Taker AoE on a random player. Now, granted, Spirit Taker is still randomized. Having it be controlled on a particular player, it's going to still be a little bit critical to actually make sure that you don't hit any of the fragments in this case scenario. However, if you want to, if a player that is untethered wants to bait the potential opportunity for a Spirit Taker to actually land on the fragment of Promise, it is possible to do that, and you can get some bonus damage, but it isn't required. That way, it's not paramount to the actual affectation. I think the way that how the damage will be compensated across the entirety of the mechanic will actually showcase the opportunity for it to actually destroy the fragment. But again, bonus damage. Then Shiva will start casting Hollowed Wing, which is a half-room cleave. Additionally, everyone has water stacks, and then you would have made your adjustments and flexibilities if necessary, and still be bound by the bow tie mechanic. Now, one of the water stacks, since Shiva is not hitting the fragments with the wing attack, must actually hit the red fragment. So since it is a singular water stack attack, the damage would normally not be too critical in terms of hitting it, but the idea behind it is that Shiva would actually hit the crystal as a result, but also if she's not hitting it, then the party would have to adjust and make that compensation and hit it as a result instead. And the tethers are still active during this, and they mustn't be broken, because if they do, they'll pop everything and then it'll explode and then be horrendous damage, and you don't want to do that. So make sure you don't do that, actually. Now, to compensate for this, though, if Shiva was casting Hollowed Wing as a half-room cleave and it does actually hit the red crystal, the damage that would normally be applied to the crystal from the water stack wouldn't actually be necessary, since it'll be going off at the same time. So Shiva's wing would actually do damage to the red crystal as a result. So there isn't any particular reason to bait the water stack on top of the crystal, because then you'll wipe it, and obviously you can kind of have that opportunity. So this is, I guess, you can consider to be a more easier version, if you will. And you can also consider the red partial stack inside of the thing to be a cursed variant, if you will. But the objective is that if Shiva hits the red crystal, then you don't have to hit it. And then if the Shiva isn't hitting it, then you have to stack with the red crystal. Now, of course, in this example, the red crystal is on the east side, but if it were on the west side instead, then it wouldn't be, it would be mirrored pretty much. And it would never appear on the north side. I didn't think I wanted to do that, all things considered. I think the opportunity would have actually worked a little bit more in terms of that like randomization, if you will. So I thought that it would be more logical. I think it could be applied though in like a northern version, but I think I'd also be changing how the mechanic works as well. So it's kind of like iffy. But I like this version, so it works itself out. Next, after the combination of all this has gone off, Gaia will do a Somber Dance Tank Buster combo that must hit the red crystal. This is exactly the same attack that we have already in the normal version of the Ultimate, but the difference is that the tank would have to stand under the red crystal, and that adjustment would be very difficult considering all the possible randomization that does exist. But I think in a theoretical concept, the party would make the adjustment so that the tank has the opportunity to bait her into the red crystal. And then should you have the opportunity where you would have both tanks swap, then you would just incorporate the swap. But it's very common that a tank, whether main tank or off tank, depending on your composition, would just invuln that combo and keep it kind of simple. So the party would need to adjust so that Gaia is able to target the furthest player being the tank while maintaining tether distance and being back at the center. And that way, in this case example, both tank buster attacks would be invulned by the tank, and then it would be applied on the red crystal. And the tethers are still active during this as well, so you would have to be very mindful about how you're actually positioning yourself as well during this mechanic. And then, of course, we have ourselves the Akmorn combo. This is where the percentage between both bosses needs to be within 5%, and then it's going to be a split damage stack per player. And in the current version of the ultimate, there is a common strategy of a 7-1 where you have a tank use their 90 cooldowns and also be given a short cooldown by their co-tank in order to actually survive all the hits and be healed in between, just to kind of ensure survivability. I actually have decided that I would have preferred that they be body check Akmorn. So you're required to do like a 4-4 split, no questions asked. The way how it would aggro on each target is still the same, but instead of doing a 7-1 strategy, I've even seen like a 6-2. I would have preferred much more so that it be a 4-4 permanently, just kind of keeping it as it was intended initially. And of course, since there is a multi-hitting Akmorn stack attack, it can't be baited on the red crystal because the multiple hits would eventually inquire a damage that would just be difficult to maintain throughout the majority of the mechanic. Even if you try to weave one hit on the crystal and then out, it would still just kind of stack multiplicatively, and then the hits just would be a little bit too much. Then after the Akmorns go off, the bosses will prepare a Mornifa, which is a 8-person stack under the entire thing. And this particular attack, since it is a singular hit, it must be used with the red crystal because the attack is very lethal if you are not actually taking the vuln down buff into account. So it will do heavy damage, and so the vuln down is actually part of the survivability of this Mornifa stack attack. And you would simply just go under the red crystal, do damage to it, take the vuln down, eat the stack, and then be able to survive and be a little bit comfy, preparing yourself for crystallized time. Now, with crystallized time, mechanically, I actually like the way that it's formed very well. But I did understand that because I've created a new opportunity for the phase where there are 3 crystals as opposed to 1. The objective is that I did not want the yellow tether, since they're always north and south in the normal variant, and then the purple tether will always swap positioning. I wanted to always maintain a cross pattern, if you will, but the difference is that they will always form the X facing the red crystal. So this pattern of tethers actually doesn't change in terms of the formation. However, the colors could be swapped. So, you know, right now the yellow tether is southwest and northeast, and then the purple tether is northwest and southeast. That can swap, but objectively completing the mechanic would be the same thing, just like a little bit mirrored. So the yellow and purple tether lights will always point to the red crystal, as you can see here. Now, objectively, crystallized time is performed the exact same way as normal in terms of placement with the dragon heads, the ice stack, the wind push. Everything is going to be the exact same thing with a small little caveat here and there, which you'll understand if you've been kind of thinking about how we've been dealing with the red crystal, because objectively we have to destroy it. But the ice stack and the wind push will actually do damage in the normal version to the ice crystal. That's why all the attacks are taken south while the crystal is north. But I've made the slight alteration where if you are not standing under the blue crystal while you're taking the attack or even dealing with it, so whether it's the ice stack, the wind push, the dragon head execution pop, it won't actually do like heavy damage. It'll do very light damage, but still like very survivable, understandable damage if you had the attack occur while you're not under the crystals of fate or relativity. Since you get the vulnerability up debuff, it lets you take a lot of more severe damage and make it very lethal, but the same thing would occur to the crystals in that case scenario. So objectively, you don't want to be under the crystals doing that. That way, it still can be functionally working in the exact same format. So pretty much, you know, you deal with the wind fragments or the wind push, the ice heads, and all that other stuff. However, the small difference here is that the Dark Corruption player, since the Dark Corruption player has a single hit attack in the form of a little spread, that must clip the Fragments of Promise. And it is imperative that you do so in order for it to allocate for the damage necessary for the result of the entire phase. Then, of course, when the push happens with the wind, the players that are together will have to deal with the stack. And similar idea, since there is a vulnerability down opportunity and the players are preparing to deal with the movement of Shiva's Hallowed Wings in terms of the cardinal positions that it is, stack players have to actually move underneath the red fragment in order to survive the stack attack with the vulnerability down. The vuln down will actually allow the stack to do very minimal damage, but the damage is more important to be applied on the crystal than it is for it to be damaged on the players. So it's pretty imperative that you actually continue to do that. Then, of course, Shiva will start to cast Hallowed Wing going the east or the west side, and then north or south, just as it is in normal version. And then the dragon heads will get popped as well during the wind push here in the bottom side. And again, since the players are not actually underneath the crystals popping that crystal, it won't do any damage to the two fragments of fate, of relativity or fate. Then, of course, as we get prepared for the objective, we line up with the rewind knockback, and then we do the spread. There is also preparation for the Spirit Taker, so you want to be very mindful of your spread. You could take advantage of the same situation where you can have a player stand under this to get the vuln down, not like a big ordeal, but objectively, once the actual attack occurs, then you would spread apart away from the Spirit Taker opportunity to hit the blue crystals, and that way you can prepare for the wind up into the knockbacks. Then, of course, they'll go off. We'll deal with them as so, and then we come back to the middle, repeat the Akmorn 4/4 stack, and again, because these are multiplicative hitting, they can't hit the actual mechanics on the red crystal, and then the final Mornifa attack that we deal with here, before the boss flies away, will be done to the memory of promise. And if this is all done correctly, which again, a lot more trickier and complicated, but still same functional mechanics, just with a little bit of extra, crystals and like a little bit less space, this will be the final attack that destroys the fragment of promise. Now, objectively, I did want to point out from beforehand, because with the Spirit Taker, that they could be casted during either Crystallized Time or during Darklit Dragon Song, if you were able to get one of the attacks off on the red crystal, let's say like random variance like helped you out in that case scenario, then ideally either the Dark Eruption or the Water Stack during the Crystallized Time mechanic would not necessarily need to be applied damage-wise to the crystal during those opportunities. That way, in case like a little bit trickier, but again, that's like a role. You shouldn't rely on the idea of it doing that. The goal is to basically make sure that all mechanics that can be controlled should hit the crystal, and the ones that are random, again, bonus damage. So let's say you have the opportunity of having Spirit Taker be landing on both targets and they hit the red crystal, then the Mornifa would still be there. But again, it's the damage for it is very, very minuscule, right? So objectively, you want to actually like apply the rule of thumb to it too. Since you're using the vulnerability down debuff as well, you really, again, it'll do bonus damage, but if you miss a thing, that's like the goal idea too. So there you go. Now, transitioning into phase 5, Shiva will absorb the 2 fragments that remain before transforming with Gaia. And by objective, it is required to be the fragments of fate and relativity. If only one fragment remains, let's say mechanically you were trying to figure things out and you get rid of fate and promise, then when you actually transition into phase 5, Pandora will be given a damage buff, but it will not provide the buff required to actually complete phase 6. And the cutscene will alter as well. So if you're going through the cutscene transition and you see phase 5, there's like a moment where Pandora is like Gaia, and then it's like, Reed, are you there? Let's say like fragment of relativity was broken. Then, you wouldn't hear Gaia go, Reen, are you there? All you would hear is Reen go, Gaia. And then that kind of gives you an indication of like, oh, looking for like both of them and they're not there, right? So I think that the objective of having both memory fragments be existing and functional going into the phase would actually allow like the true ending segue into phase 5, if you will. Now, during the transition into phase 5, if Shiva and Gaia absorb a blue fragment with the fragment of promise, then it will transform into Eden's Promise, Big Tree, and skip phase 5 entirely with an unresettable mech called the Promise of Fate or the Promise of Relativity. Now, what I mean by this is, normally in every ultimate, there's like a death wall that you can just run into and hit the reset button. I wanted to actually establish the idea that you would be severely punished for failing to execute the mech as necessary. Granted, the execution is much harder. It's still a mechanic that you have to actually execute with perfection and precision. So the punishment of failing to do that, I think, removing the wall is kind of like an idea of again, from like a lore perspective, Mitron was able to perfect his utopia for Logarithm himself, and it has become said fate of or relative promise, right? So what it'll do is pretty much it'll change the arena. It'll be the E12 arena as we know it. Tree will appear. So then, like, if it was the Promise of Fate, it'll actually execute a raid wide called the Promise of Fate, and the attack will be a heavy ice dot that increases to 16 ticks before the boss wipes everybody out and then commits to an attack called the Final Promise. And the same thing would occur if the boss was listed as the Promise of Relativity, and it'll be a raid wide with a heavy bleed attack that increases 16 ticks before casting Final Promise and then wipes the raid. Now, if you were to try and survive through this, then objectively you can last up to 16 ticks, and then the boss will cast Final Promise, and then it'll just kind of wipe everybody, right? So that at least is the idea. And again, if we were issuing this as like a first scenario case basis, then if a player or a team was doing this completely blind and they had no idea and they entered this phase, then they would progress this thinking this was the correct opportunity, right? And I think that would have been kind of fun because the boss is targetable during this mechanic. And I think people would have been very shocked by the idea and the factor to it, realizing that they're actually supposed to get to Pandora versus seeing Tree. And so I think that's the idea in mind that I at least had for phase 4. And there you have it. So I think all in all, I was really hoping that phase 4 was going to be like a very tricky and very paramount phase to actually enter what would have been considered the final phase, at least with the current version, because again the puzzle is very much like present in the moment in the current version, which is nice. And of course there is a lot of room for error, but I think that due to the pressure and severity of the storytelling that we've applicated as well to this theoretical ultimate, I think it would have also held a lot of weight that, even the slightest little issue would have immediately spiraled everything downhill, and of course having to actually get back into place and kind of bounce back into full gear to complete the phase would have been exceptionally challenging, right? And so I think that would have easily compensated like a lot of things. But that being said, though, that's the end there of phase 4, and then tune in next time we take a peek into what will be the phase mechanics of phase 5, which I think will be very awesome to kind of showcase to you as well. So thank you for watching and tuning in. I do really appreciate it, and of course I'll see you in the next one. Take care.